Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the meeting. We've still got lots of people joining. Most of our speakers are now here. In a moment, I'll hand over to Sir David Ames to formally open the meeting. Two things this afternoon. We are recording the meeting for the purposes of minutes taking. BBC Radio 4 is also joining us, and they've asked if they could record the meeting. So if any speakers do not want to have what they are going to say recorded, can they please say before they start speaking? So can I hand over to you, Sir David?
Well, I was going to begin by saying good afternoon, but it probably isn't afternoon in Australia. But welcome to everyone, including my parliamentary colleagues from both houses, group advisors, speakers, interested parties and friends. Welcome to you all to what is the third joint meetings of these two on leasehold and common hold reform, and the second part on cladding and fire safety issues. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have assembled quite an illustrious and respected list of speakers, beginning with Lord Greenhalgh, who's the Minister of State for Building, Safety, Fire and Communities. And this is my third meeting with you, Stephen, in the past 3 weeks on fire and building related issues. Now, ladies and gentlemen, only on Monday of this week, both of us heard a most terrifying, distressing and horrific account of a disabled resident, Florinida, trapped on the 23rd floor of Grenfell Tower on that fateful night, whose son, Farhad Nida, carried her down from the top to the bottom of the building at 2:30 p.m., 1.5 hours into the fire. Her husband perished, having jumped from the building, and a number of other residents, also waiting to be rescued, died on this floor. It was a humbling and incredible meeting, and I do salute Flora for having the bravery to share her experiences with us. If this doesn't bring into sharp focus the importance of getting this right once and for all, colleagues, nothing will. And there will be no room whatsoever for errors again. So can I remind everyone that the closing date for responses to the government's consultation on personal emergency evacuation plans for disabled people closes at 11:45 p.m. That's 11:45 p.m. on Monday next, the 19th of July, 2021, so very little time to make those representations. We will also hear from Law Commissioner Nicholas Hopkins, who will no doubt clarify how the important legal issues can be satisfied through the Building Safety Bill, which comes before the House next week, and from the Honourable Ted Baillieu, former Premier of the State of Victoria in Australia, and co-chair of the Victoria Cladding Task Force from 2017 to 2019. Ladies and gentlemen, it's now 1:30 a.m. in Victoria, so thank you very much for staying up so late to be with us. We are delighted. Next, we will give a warm welcome again to Dame Judith Hackitt, who led the independent review of building regulations following the Greenhalgh tragedy, and will no doubt tell us about her ongoing involvement with building safety on behalf of government. And last but by no means least, we have Deputy Fire Commissioner for London, Richard Mills, who is going to tell us what measures arising from Grenfell Phase 1 inquiry were put into practices at the recent major fire in New Providence Wharf in Poplar just 2 months ago. Now, to save me asking a question later and to give you a little time to think about it, perhaps you can tell us when you give your presentation why Poplar doesn't have an aerial high ladder, given the number of high-rise blocks in this area and the rationale behind where those specialised rescue vehicles are located in London. Now, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Martin Boyd of Leasehold Knowledge Partnership, who's going to take us through the programme today. Martin, over to you.
Good afternoon again. Thank you very much, Sir David. We now pass over to our first speaker, Lord Greenhalgh, who is going to talk to us about the Building Safety Bill and the Ground Rent Bill.
Well, Martin, and thank you, Chair, Sir David, and I know Sir Peter and other chairs, because this is a combined meeting of both the APPGs for fire safety and leasehold and common hall reform. By the way, Martin, we've got to know each other quite well, but my pronunciation is Greenhalgh.
Oh,
it's a difficult name.
Sorry.
Don't worry, but I just want to, I think we will make progress on it. It's a Lancastrian name. It's always difficult to pronounce. But no, I'll just rattle through where we are on the ground rent bill. And that was introduced in the Lords on the 12th of May. And I want to pay tribute to colleagues in the Lords from all parties that have come forward with a number of suggested improvements for the bill. And we've done our best to engage constructively, listen, and we've also tabled a number of amendments that we think improve what the bill is aiming to do. And this is obviously the first phase of leasehold reform, with the next phase hopefully following shortly afterwards, that looks at some of the issues that Professor Hopkins has been dealing with, including obviously enfranchisement, common hold, the adoption of full-throated common hold, I've learned to call it, as opposed to common hold light, and right to manage. But those are issues that were covered in his important report. But we're making good progress. We've come to committee stage before summer recess next week. The aim of this bill is to set ground rents in new residential long leases with no financial demand at a genuine peppercorn rent, to ban freeholders from charging for collection of ground rent, to introduce new rights for leaseholders to seek a refund of any ground rent paid where it shouldn't have been demanded, and introducing new rights for trading standards to levy penalties on freeholders. And one of the amendments is to increase the level of the penalty from up to 30,000, so from between 500 and 30,000 for breaches of the law. I think it's a good bill, and very much part of this two-pronged approach. We do recognise that we need to support existing leaseholders, and that's why we asked the Competition and Markets Authority to investigate mis-selling of homes and unfair practices in the housing market. And as many of you all know, the CMA announced that Countryside and Taylor Wimpey must remove all unfair ground rents in existing contracts to bring in line with the law, and they need to agree not to use terms these terms again in any future leasehold contracts. And in June, more recently, the CMA announced commitments from Aviva and Persimmon to amend their practices regarding the escalation of ground rents, doubling ground rents, and houses sold as leasehold. And we're obviously encouraging other developers to follow suit. Now, on the second wave of reform, we'll be looking at enfranchisement, and I think it's great that you've got Professor Hopkins speaking today. This is obviously a very important area that we're looking into, and we asked the Law Commission to review the legislation on leasehold enfranchisement, and the government's objective is to make it easier, quicker, and more cost-effective for leaseholders to buy their freehold and extend their lease. And so we are going to reform the valuation process to calculate the cost of extending the lease or buying the freehold. We will cap ground rents in the enfranchisement valuation process at 0.1% of the freehold value. We're also proposing to abolish marriage value and prescribe rates for the calculation of market value, introduce an online calculator to standardize the process and make it fairer, all measures that we think will hopefully help leaseholders to enfranchise more easily than they have been hitherto. And obviously statutory lease extension to increase to 990 years, from 90 years for flats and 50 years for houses, with and those with those extended leases with zero ground rent on payment of a premium. So those are the kind of those are the plans around enfranchisement. Obviously, Martin, you're going to be a member of our Common Hold Council when you get your form in, but we've got a very active group that's met twice as part of the Common Hold Council, and I've chaired one meeting. Secretary of State kicked this off a couple of months ago, and it is very important that we look at how we can prepare the market for Common Hold. We recognise there have been attempts in the past that haven't worked, and we're very keen to learn from those and do what we can to make sure that Common Hold takes over as the tenure of choice instead of leasehold. And we recognise that there's much to be learnt from other countries where the Common Hold thrives, not least north of the border in Scotland, and we're very keen to learn from that. So the early soundings from the Common Hold Council are that lenders are willing to lend on Common Hold, and many of them, a large proportion of the major ones are very up for doing this, and currently are prepared to lend. Developers are moving towards what I describe as a kind of Common Hold light system, and we're looking at how we can encourage them to want to go further, and using beyond resident management companies. And I think we're making good progress, but we don't underestimate that there's more to be done. Now, I know that these meetings, it's all about the questions rather than the speeches. It's fair to say that we have now introduced the Building Safety Bill, having gone through quite a lengthy pre-legislative scrutiny process, and we've responded to the comments from the Select Committee, and accepted a large number of them, and the bill has necessarily become bigger. The draft Building Safety Bill was around 119 clauses, which I already thought was a mammoth bill. It's now 147 clauses with 9 schedules instead of 8, and we're now in 6 parts for the bill rather than 5. I thought clearly this is a critical bill, at least from the important work that Dame Judith, who will be speaking to you today, carried out with her review. It establishes the building safety regulator for high-rise residential buildings, but also hospitals above 18 metres and care homes. That's written into the face of the bill, which was one of the recommendations of the Select Committee. But I thought I should just highlight some of the areas where the bill has changed since introduction. Firstly, we've extended homeowners' rights to compensation, looking at a longer limitation period under Section 1 of the Defective Premises Act from 6 to 15 years, applying that retrospectively. So that's strengthening redress. We've also been cognizant of many of the criticisms around the drafting around the building safety charge, to make sure that the charge will now only cover the ongoing costs of implementing this new regime, not the costs of remediating historic building safety defects. So that's been made very clear in the revised bill, as well as strengthening some of the protections, trying to strengthen protections for leaseholders by insisting on that current leaseholders there's only a call from the building owner, the freeholder, to get them to contribute to costs after they've gone through all alternative funding routes, including through government grant, finance, warranties, insurance, and litigation. So there's that protection for leaseholders added into the bill. But those are 3 changes I wanted to draw attention to the group today. Now, that's a lot. There's a lot. These are 2 major bits of legislation. They are obviously progressing in parallel. The Building Safety Bill will be going through the House of Commons. I've started obviously with the first wave of leasehold reform in the House of Lords. It's a very busy time, and both bills are incredibly important if we want to learn the lessons from Grenfell, but also given opportunities to establish a new system around Common Hold in the future in this country, and give the leaseholders a chance to become homeowners as many are able to on the continent. So that's what all I would like to say in at this point, and happy to take questions when the chair deems it right to do so.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I'm going to give up trying to pronounce your second name. Sorry for that. Could we ask that if any members of Parliament would like a question, they raise a hand. If for non-members of Parliament, could we ask you to put your questions in the chat, and we'll try and collate them, but there's too many people here to try and get every question in. So I'm now going to try and find which MPs are looking to ask a question. If any of the other co-hosts spot an MP with a hand raised, please. Hilary.
Martin, thank you very much indeed. And Stephen, thank you for that update. You talked about historic safety defects. Leaving aside the cladding defects, which the government says it's prepared to pay for, who do you think should pay for the historic safety defects that are not covered by the government's funding? So flammable insulation, missing fire breaks, wooden balconies, those kind of things. Who's going to foot the bill for that? Because as you know, leaseholders are currently being asked to cough up the cash, and clearly they shouldn't pay. So who do you think should pay, and how's that going to work? Thank you.
Stephen, you have to take yourself off mute.
Oh, sorry. Well, that's sorry about that, Hilary. I was trying to make sure I was courteous in muting myself whilst you spoke and then forgot to unmute. Apologies. No, the first thing to say is that every building needs to be looked at an individual level. But largely, if I was to generalise, many of the defects you outline are certainly in contravention of building regulations then or at any time. And then so in terms of I think that would then falls on the responsibility of the person who built the building, and that the developers need to front up and pay for a lot of these defects that you mentioned. But I am aware that sometimes warranty periods have passed, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to take this opportunity to strengthen the mechanisms around redress.
Can I just follow that up with what happens where the developer and the builder have gone bust and no longer exist? Who's going to pay then?
Well, I mean, there are circumstances, and you know, it's a kind of question where you know the answer. But the answer is that it can, in law, as things stand, under landlord tenant law over many years, and the way leases are today, it can in some circumstances, and particularly the circumstance you've outlined, it can fall on the leaseholder where there's no developer available to go after, as you say. And then the choice is, does the taxpayer front up all the cash for all of this, or the leaseholder?
That is indeed the question. No, thank you, Stephen.
Daisy.
Thank you very much, Martin. Hi, Stephen. A couple of questions from me. I mean, the first is that, as you know, there's been a major cross-party push to try and protect leaseholders from any of the costs of remediating fire safety defects that are not of their making. The government has variously made different pledges at different times about, first of all, saying that leaseholders would be protected from those costs, and then saying that leaseholders would be protected from unaffordable costs. And now there's sort of legislation which, as you just admitted, will allow some costs to go to leaseholders. And yet there hasn't really been any discussion about, if there's not going to be legislation to protect leaseholders from all costs, what do you regard as an acceptable or an affordable cost? Because many leaseholders are getting bills for 60, 70, 80, 90, £100,000, which they cannot afford. And so some clarity on that would be helpful. And then the second question really is that, as you know, the Cladding Action Group and others put a 10-point plan forward to the government, suggesting that it could be the government that puts the money forward in the first place and then uses its power of being in government to recoup those costs. And in the absence of doing that, we're effectively asking leaseholders, many of whom are not legal experts, who are potentially suffering from mental ill health, who are stuck in their homes, who are potentially facing bankruptcy, and we're asking them to take on the burden of trying to sue these mega, enormous, powerful companies when they do not have the financial resources or the mental resilience or the wherewithal to do so. So I just wonder if you can give us any explanation as to why if there's any objection to the government stepping in to do that on behalf of leaseholders? Because that's what I think many people would like to see.
Well, I mean, clearly, the focus that we've had as a government is to recognise that not all building safety defects are equal, that cladding is an accelerant of the spread of fire, and then we've seen that on time and time again in high-rise residential buildings, and we've focused our intervention around helping to fund the costs of the remediation of cladding where the warranties or the developers not at this stage in a position to or won't fund that remediation. With regards to the other building safety works, and we really need to know the extent of the problem there. But at this stage, you're right, at the moment, if the building owner or the developer, the original developer, doesn't step forward, then the leaseholders are facing the costs of that remediation. And I recognise that's in some cases these are life-changing costs, but that's the situation, as you know, we are in. This is a problem that has brewed up over many decades, and it's already requiring quite a considerable increase in government support for leaseholders, in the sense that, over the period of time that I've held office, which is just a little over a year, we've moved from a 600 million fund for ACM cladding to 5.1 billion of funding to remediate cladding. So we recognise this is a huge problem, and recognise also that we aren't covering those non-cladding defects at this stage as a government.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, we have one more question from David Bishop. David.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Stephen, for your replies to this. And this really was a kind of poison chalice that you've inherited when you came into post, and grateful for the courteous way in which you're dealing with it. I guess for me, the situation won't be over until people are able to sell their property and get a decent price for it. I mean, that for me is the acid test, whether the problem is cladding or whether it's because cladding has exposed so much else that is wrong in high and medium rise dwellings in this country. And particularly because a lot of people, if I look at the flats in Manchester, Salford, in my patch, these are often young households. They get to the point where they're wanting to have kids, form a family, and it's no longer quite so appropriate to live in a high or medium rise block. And of course, these folks are stuck at the moment. They're not able to sell their property. And so can you give us any sense of when there'll be closure on this for those people who are at the moment are stuck where they don't really want to live because their personal circumstances have changed but are unable to get out?
Well, I recognise, Bishop David, that you're talking about the wider housing problem, where a number of people are in buildings that need to be remediated. They failed the EWS1 survey or equivalent required by the banks, and then they're waiting therefore for the remediation to happen that will enable the value to return in their property, which is one of the reasons why we're focusing on interventions that make sure that we move quickly in that regard. The first wave of the Building Safety Fund has been on a first come, first served basis. We've tried to ensure that we support the training of more assessors that can carry out the work, because there's not been enough of them. We're looking at, so I think we've trained around close to 900 building surveyors to add to the small number of fire engineers that are currently covered to do this work, so that these can be carried out more quickly. We also recognise that there's a problem, particularly around professional indemnity insurance around this particular form. So we're trying to develop an intervention that supports that. All of these are small incremental measures that we hope to deal with what we recognise is a significant problem for these young people caught in this situation, to enable them to get the stuff sorted out so they can move on with their lives. But what I would say, and this is something become a phrase that's I think we all need to call for, is that we need greater proportionality, and that we need to see the insurers, the lenders, it shouldn't have a binary response that something that was worth hundreds of thousands of pounds is now written down on their books as of no value. But we need, so we're doing all we can to engage with the banks and with insurance companies to be more proportionate in their assessments. And that's incredibly important. And that word proportion is important, because I know that many people are worried about the life safety implications, but statistically, with the exception of 2017, the number of deaths that are in high rises is very, very low. Actually, it was 3 in the last year and has remained very, very low and trending downwards over the last decade. So we recognise the need to remediate these buildings from a life safety standpoint, but very few fires spread from the room of origin. Obviously, when they do, it can be tragic. So we're working as a government and engaging very extensively on how we can get a more proportionate response to these matters.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Minister. I'm running way late on time as we expected, but it was important, obviously, to get as many questions as we could. There's loads more written questions in the chat, which we'll arrange to get sent to you. I think, have you got to disappear immediately, or are you staying around to listen to our Australian friends?
I will try and I'm going to break the rule of my private office and stay as long as I can. And apologies, I couldn't answer all the questions, but it's your fault for having such a star-studded panel anyway. But it's great. I'll try and listen certainly to Ted and others as long as I can. Thank you.
All right then, thank you. All right, well, without further ado, can I ask Ted Baillieu to speak? And if I've mispronounced your surname, I apologise for that as well.
Well, you're pretty close.
Thanks.
So let's not sweat on that, but I'm going to share a screen if that's okay. Hopefully it will work. You've got to allow me to share it though.
Kath, can you do that, please?
Please just give me a minute.
You can find Ted, haven't you, on the system?
Yeah.
Well, Kath finds you on the system and lets you start to share the screen, Ted. Would you like to sort of start?
Well, let me say up front, Martin, I acknowledge Stephen and Nicholas and Judith, and I've worked a little bit with both of them, and I met Judith after Grenfell fire, and also acknowledge Richard and all of your participants. And you're shaking your head there, Catherine. I don't know.
I'm so sorry. I think only the person that set up the Zoom can actually allow people to share screens. Sorry, Martin, even though I'm co-host, I can't find the control. I do have your PowerPoint. I can share it if there's a problem.
Yeah, okay. Well, if you share it for the moment, then I'll...
Yeah, will do. Okay. Just give me 1 second. Apologies for this. Okay. Share screen.
I don't know whether I'll be able to move it along, Catherine, if you share it.
No, but if you ask me, you just say next slide, I will do it for you.
All right, well, you're going to be busy.
Okay, yeah, I realised that. I saw the number of slides. Can everybody see the screen now and see the slides?
All right, well, let's fire through, and I'll just say next slide, Catherine, and we're going to move quickly through some slides. But for those who I haven't met and don't know me, I was Premier of Victoria up till 8 years ago. I think we're up to now, nearly 8 years. And the state of Victoria, one of 6 states in Australia, we had an early entry into the cladding issue. We've been through a number of phases, really 3 stages of addressing this issue. And I think we've done some things well, uniquely. We've learned a lot. It's proceeding quite well. And we have a situation where there's a general confidence amongst homeowners and industry, and that's a positive. And if we can go to the first slide, please, Catherine. We hope. I just want to stress up front, we have regarded this as a public safety issue from the start. We don't regard it as a legal issue or as a political issue or as a technical issue or a financial issue or parliamentary issue. It's a public safety issue, It's about public safety, not just for the homeowners, but for neighbours, for people fighting fires, and it's about the human tragedy involved. And some of that tragedy is the loss of value. And that's been the overriding principle for us. Next slide. The reality about combustible cladding is that it's incredibly complex to fix. It's going to take a lot of time. And I know there's some British members of parliament who think they might be able to fix this by June next year. Good luck. It's going to be very expensive. It's inflationary in the building industry. It'll be contentious at time. It's going to require government involvement. Lawyers love it. Insurers love it. It's a litigator's delight. And it is a challenge for politicians because governments of all persuasions have been involved in what I would describe as the building of inappropriate buildings over the last 20 or 30 years. And forgive the language, we say for 20 or 30 years, our industry has been building crap. And that's a problem for all of us. And if you think it's going to go away quickly, next slide, a little reminder. In New Zealand, they've had a cladding issue. It's been going for 20 years nearly, sometimes called the leaky building syndrome or the sick building syndrome. The government had to intervene because everybody else walked away. And if you want to read about it, this book will cover it off. And there's little New Zealand, similar landmass as Victoria, similar landmass as the UK, but a fraction of the economy. And the estimate so far, $47 billion to deal with that issue. And next slide, please. And beyond that, as you've just been discussing, it's not just cladding. The audits involved in Australia have revealed all the other systemic defects. We have, as I said, been building crap. So let's follow the story on cladding and we'll go through the various phases. There've been a lot of fires and the fires continue. Next slide. Next slide. And just as an example, we can go back to 2009 in China, fire with deaths in Shanghai in 2010. We had a fire in 2014, which was really the commencement of our first stage involvement in our central business district, and of course Grenfell in 2017, but those fires continue. And just to remind you, next slide. This is Shanghai, next slide. Dubai, next slide, the La Crosse fire in Melbourne. And this, as I said, next slide, was our stage one. And the government in Victoria responded at the time and took some action. And an audit was commenced by our local council. There were some temporary measures put in place and some national meetings took place. And it really came to pass, but the fires continued. Next slide. Again, Dubai. Next slide again. The Marina Tower, the Torch Tower, ironically named. And next slide. Of course, Grenfell in June 2017. And that was the commencement of our second stage. Next slide. And the government responded by advancing the Senate inquiry, and they set up the task force of which I was co-chair. We currently have a Labor government in the state of Victoria. I'm from the Liberal or Conservative side of politics. I was a Liberal Premier, but I was appointed co-chair on a bipartisan basis with a former Deputy Premier of a Labor government. So the two of us from both sides of politics. We also set up a stakeholders group, and there was more work done with the national building ministers, and a pilot audit was commenced. But the fires, again, the fires continued. Next slide. And next slide again, we had another fire in Melbourne. Next slide. At the Neo building in 2019. Next slide, we released our interim report in November 2017. Next slide. That covered a range of issues. I'm not going to go into them in detail. Next slide. We made a number of recommendations, including a statewide proactive audit using some audit tools, and asking Treasury, the State Treasury, to start modelling finance arrangements for fixing. And we produced in that interim report some key findings. Next slide. And I think you'd be familiar with some of those. Next slide. The key to that, system failures at 3 levels: supply chain, culture, and problems with compliance and enforcement. And next slide, we reached a fundamental proposition that it was one about public safety, first about public safety, and second about preventing it from happening in the future. Next slide. And when it comes to public safety, you've got to find the buildings first, and then you've got to fix them and fund them. And the prevention is all about the future. So the immediate task was public safety to find, fix, and fund the buildings. Next slide. And we commenced with a government program looking at private buildings, vulnerable classes. We used planning permits to filter the exercise trying to find the buildings. We set up an audit tool, and there was this proactive exercise of auditing. And we set up expert panels to risk rate every building that had been found with combustible cladding using international risk rating measures. And the cladding types, next slide, that we covered were the ACPs, but also the expanded polystyrene. So we covered them both. Next slide. We set up a system to do it. Next slide. And in terms of the cohort, we addressed everything 3 stories and above in classes where there were overnight stays. And that's the essential model. We said for commercial buildings, up to the commercial operators and owners to deal with that. Next slide. We said the government would fix its own buildings, and this is part of the fix program, and private fix would focus on extreme and high risk. We had to set some rectification standards, and a lot of work went into that. And we used tools of orders, fines, and various exercises there. Next slide. Part of the fix, it was very evident that it was going to be very complex. Each building's different. They're brownfield. Nobody really wants to work on them. It would require complex arrangements with all the stakeholders, and it was going to take time and going to be expensive. Next slide. Then it came to a question of funding. The government were going to self-fund their own. As I said, the commercial sector would self-fund theirs. And the residential sector, we had some court rulings on the table as to who was responsible. But our owners' corporations, the management companies, were in control, and they were facing bills up to $100,000 a unit. And so before the last state election, the government, in its wisdom, announced what they call cladding rectification agreements, low-cost loans to assist. And I think that probably served a need at the time coming into an election. But the reality is not a single loan was undertaken or accepted by a homeowner. The local councils didn't want to administer them, and asking homeowners to wear a lien effectively on their titles for problems they didn't cause themselves was a completely unattractive proposition, regardless of what the interest rate was. And we recognised then that at that stage that further assistance was going to be needed. Next slide. So it came to how we kept this fine going on. And this is an example of what was a weekly dashboard for the number of buildings that were being inspected, the expert panels that were reviewing those buildings, and the sort of risk ratings that were going on. Next slide. One of the things that became very evident that politicians love to talk about the future, banning products, changing the code, changing legislation, getting different responsibilities arranged, different insurance arrangements. That's all about the future. And that has very little impact on the now and on the fix. And it had very little impact on defective products. And I think worldwide, this has been a problem, that the issue has gravitated to talking about the future and not dealing with the fix. Next slide. We adopted some principles that we would put in place: public safety, risk-based, making sure that everything was signed off, sustainable, best practice, and that the insurance arrangements were innovative. Next slide. There was still all the other defects started to come to pass, and I won't go into them in detail, but there's some been very prominent examples in Australia, including structural problems. Next slide was really the beginning of stage 2B, where we released our final report. Next slide. And that covered a range of areas. Next slide. And I won't go into them in detail. We made a number of recommendations in that final report in 2019. Next slide. They included you'll see down the bottom there, a dedicated rectification authority and a government building rectification, all the government buildings being rectified by that authority as well. And then the second column there, we recommended that the only way we were going to get a fix is the government funded first. And that government funding step was bipartisan, and it's proved to be effective. And down the bottom of that second column, you'll see we recommended that the government then use its strength to recover through litigation. Next slide. The other defects that revealed, of course, concrete cancer has been around for a while, but we've seen defects with plumbing, ventilation, asbestos, glass, wiring, as you can see, and many other fire protection issues. Next slide. The government's response to us was to say, all right, we accept your recommendations, and they established what was called Cladding Safety Victoria. The Cladding Task Force, of which I was co-chair, was advisory. Cladding Safety Victoria was an agency of government, independent, funded and established, and its task was to manage and fund rectification and do so at high and extreme risk. Money from consolidated revenue was put into it, and some money from a levy on all future building permits over a certain size. And it got underway in the very first budget. And we regarded that as a world first program, and it's being continued now. Next slide. And the reality is, where are we up to? There are still fires. The find is continuing. We're still finding buildings. The fix is underway through Cladding Safety Victoria. There's $600 million available, and that's government led, plus the cost of fixing government buildings and the levy. And there's still work to do on the future, and Dame Judith is involved with our committee here looking at the future. Next slide. As for Cladding Safety Victoria, it was formed quickly after our report in 2019. As I said, an agency. Its task is to fix, facilitate and contract, and to fund, and to learn and acquire knowledge and data, and that empower it to take some legal action. And that then takes us to the next slide, which is just some dashboards from Cladding Safety Victoria and their monthly reporting basis, and they're very proactive. That next slide. I'm not going to go into these in detail, just to give you a sample of the sort of work that they're doing. Next slide. And they're working out new ways of, next slide, of risk rating as well. And they're working out the scope of funded works and preparing information on that basis. Next slide. And obviously, next slide, they're looking also at the implications for insurance in the future. Next slide. As legal issues go, Cladding Safety Victoria's accumulated that experience, the knowledge, the data. It's using the government strength as a powerful force to not only seek resolution, but to seek to take up cases, to recognise the limitations of homeowners being involved. And so those rights have been assigned to government when a fix takes place, and hopefully to act as a deterrent. Next slide. The fires are still going on. Arson in Santiago in 2019, just a reminder of what can still happen. Next slide. And again, another fire in South Korea in 2020, and there have been others. So next slide. What have we done well? I think early advocacy, those first audits, having an advisory task force which was bipartisan, putting public safety as the principal focus, a proactive search, an audit tool. That audit is comprehensive. The risk rating by independent experts is essential. The establishment of a government agency, the money up front, the continuing leadership, and identifying the other defects. Next slide. What have we learnt? Well, it is about public safety, and bipartisanship makes that work. Proactivity is essential. Risk rating is essential. Cladding's not the only issue, and this is fundamental. Homeowners should not pay And the reality is they cannot pay. Loans for homeowners or leaseholders in your sector simply don't work, and they won't work. And one of our states has tried loans recently on this issue, and they haven't got any takers either. This will cost much more than most people expect, and it will be essential that the government and industry do the funding. And it's going to take longer than you think. And as I said earlier, it's very easy to talk about change in the future, but that won't fix the current problem. And owners, corporations, leaseholder management groups simply don't have the capacity, the experience, or the funds to litigate. And governments will have to accept the litigation task. And finally, next slide. Doing nothing isn't an option if you want to fix. If you want to fix, avoidance it will just get you into trouble. And if you seek to avoid, you can't fit these things under the carpet. And if you don't fix, people will die. And if you don't fix, people will go broke. And if you don't fix, people will be in terrible trouble. And that makes it a broad public safety issue. And next slide, the final slide. You've got to do it. You've got to find, fix, fund, and it's got to be fair to all the homeowners who weren't responsible. Otherwise, you're going to have more fire. And we used to remind ourselves at every meeting, or have we done enough today so that we will feel comfortable if there's a fire tonight? Because that's the reality. The fires continue and people will die if we don't fix the buildings now. I'll leave it there, Mark.
Ted, I think you got 2 or 3 offers of a job during that talk. That was an absolutely, wonderful talk. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of people will recognise things that you said. We're running very tight on time. 2 things for you. 1, can we share your slides with people after the meeting? And 2, can we send you some of the written questions that have come pouring in while you've been talking?
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you very much for that. Okay. We ought really to try and move on, otherwise we're never going to finish this meeting in time. If somebody wants to tell me that one of the MPs has put a hand up and I should be asking them a question, please shout at me now. If not, we will move on to Dame Judith Hackitt. Dame Judith, could we ask you to... Afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon. And thanks, Ted. Good to see you. And really great presentation. I'll keep this very brief, Martin, because I think you've heard a lot from Stephen already. But you asked me to come along and brief people on what I'm doing currently and some of my personal thoughts on all of this. The ongoing activity I'm involved with is 1, setting up the new regulator. So I chair the transition board that is setting up the new building safety regulator that's mentioned in the bill. And as you know, I've been chairing the industry safety steering group for 3 years now. We do have to take industry on a journey to recognise the need to raise standards. And that is a big task. We cannot just do this by regulatory reform. And the amount of work that is going into raising those standards in the industry is enormous. Earlier on today, I was involved in we've been meeting with the industry again about how we can move them further and faster, because as Ted said, we have got to fix this problem for the future. That is not to belittle the problem that we're living with in terms of the current issues. But what I thought was particularly interesting in Ted's presentation was the important message he shared with us about needing to fix the highest priorities and to focus our attention where it is most needed. And I think that's a really important lesson that we need to heed and build into our plans for dealing with the current challenge. But having said that, my main message today is it really is important that we fix this problem for the future, because if we don't fix it, the problem that we're living with is getting bigger. And whilst, as I said, I think we have to have some real hard discussions about how we do that in terms of the current issues and try and remove some of these obstacles with insurance, with lending, with unnecessary work, I suspect, taking place in a lot of buildings right now, which is putting even more burden onto people than is necessary. I am absolutely sure that it is right and proper that this building safety bill comes into being and that we actually change the system on a once in a generation basis so that we put a stop to this poor standard of building that has been going on around the world for years. And that's really all I want to say, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Dame Judith. Have we got any MPs or members of Parliament who would like to ask Dame Judith a question? If not, then it would be very useful if we could move on to our next speaker, who is going to be covering non-building safety issues, Professor Nick Hopkins.
Thanks very much, Martin. And I can also be very brief in what I have to say. It was the 21st of July last year when we at the Law Commission published our final reports on enfranchisement, right to manage and common hold. And we launched those reports at a meeting of the Common Hold and Leasehold, APPG. They followed on from the report we'd published in January last year, setting out the options for government to reduce the price payable on enfranchisement. I'm not going to go into the contents of those reports, as I've talked about those to you before. You will know they are lengthy reports, sort of over 2,000 pages in total, with over 320 recommendations for government to consider. And so we did set government quite a task in responding to us. And while we're still waiting for government's full response, we did, of course, have the very positive announcement by the Secretary of State in January this year. And the work that we've been doing at the Law Commission has certainly not come to an end. Unlike some of the reports that we publish, our leasehold reports did not include draft bills, but we know that legislation will be needed if they are to be taken forward as part of that second stage of reform that Lord Greenhalgh referred to. And so since the publication of the reports, at government's request, we've been undertaking preliminary work for legislation, including preparing instructions to Parliamentary Council for all three of those reports. We've also, again at government's request, been reviewing and updating two earlier Law Commission bills. The bill attached to our 2006 report on termination of tenancies, which abolishes forfeiture, and the bill attached to our 2011 report on making land work, which has some crossovers to our work on enfranchisement. Lord Greenhalgh indicated what the government had said in the January announcement in relation, first of all, to valuation, effectively reflecting the scheme that we put forward as Scheme 1 in our January valuation report, the scheme that is most favourable to leaseholders, and which also should remove much of the disputes in enfranchisement claims through prescribing rates and providing that online calculator. Then secondly, taking forward the first three recommendations in our enfranchisement report, particularly the 990-year lease extension, that will really put both security and the value very firmly in the leaseholders' hands. And then thirdly, the creation of the Common Hold Council, supported by a technical support group of which I'm a member. So we know there is a long way to go, but we've also, I think, travelled quite a long way since I first spoke to the Common Hold and Leasehold APPG when we were consulting on our 13th programme and set out the top 10 issues that leaseholders had raised with us during the course of that consultation. The momentum for reform is clear. The January announcement sets the government an ambitious agenda. And for our part, we look forward to receiving government's final response to our recommendations and assuming that they are accepted and taken forward, doing what we can to support their implementation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Nick. we will quickly move on to our final speaker rather than ask you any questions. There may be some coming in the chat, but thanks for that update. Hopefully you'll have more to update us on at the next meeting. Okay, to our final speaker, please. Richard Mills from the London Fire Brigade.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chair. And thank you for inviting me along to talk about New Province Wharf and our response to the incident. I've listened with interest to some of the discussions here. What I'm going to try and do is give you an overview of the practical impact of the fail-built environment and how we responded to New Province Wharf and the learning from Grenfell. And then, if I may, I'll cover Sir David's question at the end around the aerial appliances not being within the area of Poplar. So on the 7th of May, London Fire Brigade attended a fire at New Province Wharf in Poplar Tower Hamlets, where we declared a major incident and a mass evacuation of the block very quickly after arriving at the incident. In attending the fire, we had 20 fire engines there, 2 aerial appliances, breathing apparatus, a number of jets, thermal image camera, and the use of a drone, and utilised 120 firefighters to fight the fire that started on the 8th floor, externally travelling to the 9th, 10th and 11th floor. Now, you'll see in the media there was external ACM cladding that was involved on the 8th and 9th floor. And whilst it was involved, it was not the significant contribution to the fire development. And I can cover that later with my colleague who's in on the call, Charlie Pugsy from Fire Investigation. Now, the ACM cladding was the same for Grenfell Tower, and the actual New Province Wharf itself had a waking watch on a 24/7 system. And as a result of the ACM cladding, it moved from a stay put policy back in 2017 to a simultaneous evacuation process. Now, when we attended the fire, and Lord Greenhalgh is absolutely correct that we work on the premise that the fire is contained within the building itself or with the room of origin. The fire had actually spread outside and was going up externally, but there was significant smoke travelling through the building. Now, some of that was contributed to the smoke ventilation system within New Province Wharf that acted like a broken chimney because it wasn't acting as it was proposed to do. And that resulted in a life-threatening situation which required the officers and the firefighters who attended to change their firefighting tactics to mass evacuation. Now, during that time, and it was about 9 o'clock in the morning when this incident occurred, there were 67 people self-evacuated. There were 34 people in total from the block that we rescued, and the LAS and the paramedic had 37 treated on scene, 2 of them being taken to hospital, including a firefighter who sustained injuries in their rescue activities. Now, the cause of the fire is currently being determined as an electrical fault, potentially within a timer switch contained within the consumer unit. And we're going to continue to look at the investigation, not only on the cause of the fire, but obviously potential breaches of any fire safety regulations or how the building had been managed. Now, to reflect the significant response that we put and to reassure people about the changes we've learned post-Grenfell, there were many procedures and equipment and training that had gone in place that saw the successful resolution of this incident. I'd like to remind people that although this is a high-rise building, we have got examples where other buildings have failed below high-rise definitions, and a lot of the training that we've provided is about changing the way in which we try and get firefighters and officers to think when a building does fail or start to fail catastrophically. So some of the significant changes we've put in place post-Grenfell is we've developed our fire survival guidance policy, which was utilised on the day, and that involves people being trained on the scene to recognise the building's not behaving correctly, and people within control who have the direct contact with those people that are trapped within the building. Now, the way in which it works is that they both connect together with our control room and our front of line with a dedicated airwave communication, and they work in tandem to identify where these people are trapped within the building, and then to get firefighters and officers to go move them directly to that location to carry out those rescues. In addition to that, we've changed the way in which we undertake high-rise firefighting, and the policy was formally agreed and introduced in June. And we also have a mass evacuation policy, which we enacted on the day to work on the system of how we undertake the process of identifying those that need to be evacuated first. In addition to these policies, we implemented, as well as the rescues, the use of our fire escape hoods, which we placed and provided to 22 people that couldn't get through the smoke and evacuated them from the building. Now, that is the first brigade to introduce the fire escape hoods. We've used them at 45 instances already and managed to rescue over 101 people, which we normally would have to carry them or ask them to walk through the fire. This was a very challenging incident. There were 190 flats within the block concerned. We were very fortunate that it was during the day, but we recognised that could have been very, very different in the evening when more people were there, more people were asleep. We also recognised the way in which people are behaving post-COVID and how many people we work from home, that we're going to have further challenges when we attend these incidents. On a general point, I'm very proud of what the fire crews, the officers and the control officers did on that day to make this resolution a successful one, where we only had 2 and a firefighter colleague going to hospital. And that is absolutely a testament with some of the training and some of the equipment that we've managed to bring into service and continue to bring into service. We continue to develop as we learn. On the wider point around the cultural change, we as a London Fire Brigade and also as the National Fire Service are still not seeing the culture around fire safety really being gripped around high-rise policy by many industries and by many individuals. This is not just about high-rise, it's about failing built environment. I appreciate we've spoken about cladding and ACM cladding here today, but the fundamental failure of this building was not because of the cladding, it was because of other things around fire safety and other things around the built environment. Now, I'm very grateful that you've given me an opportunity to be here and to have the opportunity to answer any questions. But what I would like to see, as well as remediation of the current buildings, legislation and building legislation that will give us the levels of enforcement that will enable us to actually deal with the current buildings, but also shape the future buildings. Because we recognise this is going to be a generational problem, and how we fight these fires when buildings fail has to fundamentally change. If I can go on to Sir David's question around high-rise vehicles within London. So we work on a pan-London response when we attend fires. So 20 fire engines attended. We don't hold 20 fire engines within the borough of Tower Hamlets. They were drawn from all of the local area, and then we backfill. We apply the same principle with aerial appliances. Now, we have 11 aerial appliances currently in service, and we have 3 high 64-metre aerials that are coming into service as from September onwards. Now, we worked and we reviewed after Grenfell in 2018. We carried out an aerial review, and this included the modelling of aerial locations as part of the London Safety Plan, but also known on the fires and the locations of building above 18 metres. As a consequence of that, the average response time with an aerial appliance is 10 minutes. And in the case of this particular incident, the aerial appliance that attended was from Old Kent Road, which is less than 6 miles away, to deal with the fire. We will continue to look at operational cover as we go into our next community risk management plan, which is due for publication next year. But we recognise that the way in which we fight high-rise firefighting is about compartmentation, and breaching of compartmentation gives us those challenges, it gives the community those challenges. Even with a 64-metre aerial, there are buildings higher than that within the London boundary. We fight fires in high-rise buildings from the inside out. That's how we put fires out. The main challenge with New Province Wharf was, yes, we were fighting the fire from both the outside and inside, but it was the smoke travel that was going on inside the building that you don't see from some of the media footage. So we need to have buildings that behave as we expect them to enable us to fight the fires the way we should do. We cannot facilitate firefighting purely on the outside of buildings, because all you need to do is look at the skyline of London and the growing number of high-rise buildings across all boroughs that are above 64 metres. So we are very, very much reliant on the gold-plated standard of fire safety, and what we should be doing is about safer by design. We celebrate and champion vehicles with high safety features within them. We celebrate the fact buildings are high in security. But do we actually put an onus on building designers and builders about the gold standard of fire safety that we need in there? And it should be a sales piece to residents to say your building is the safest it can be, and should an event occur, your building will enable the firefighters to come and put that fire out within the compartment as quickly and safely as possible. So thank you very much for your time. I hope that answers David's question, and I welcome any further questions.
Thank you very much for that, Richard. Perhaps I should ask Sir David Ames first, if he'd like to sort of respond to the answer you gave on high-rise ladders.
Well, that was a lot to absorb, and I'm just going to reflect on it, really, but very, very, very grateful for your very full answer. You took a lot of trouble. Thank you. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
A bit of an education for me as well.
Martin, can I have a follow-up, please?
Certainly, Ronnie.
Just a follow-up, not on the ladders, but we've heard about all those fires in high rises around the world, and but none of them were in the extent of the one in Grenfell Tower with 72 lives lost. And one of the significant reasons for this is that the block in Melbourne was sprinkler protected. The blocks in all the other places have been sprinkler protected. Whilst the sprinklers may well have been overwhelmed to a degree, nobody lost their lives in Melbourne. And I think this is a very significant thing. And I'd like to ask Richard about his views on automatic fire sprinkler protection, because the building safety bill is really about new buildings. But we're talking about all these buildings that are existing now, like New Providence Wharf, like Grenfell Tower, like Lacanau House, that weren't sprinkler protected. And of course, now we know that we're going to sprinkler protect buildings over 11 metres, but they're only new buildings. And there's all these buildings, 4,000 plus over 18 metres, that are still not sprinkler protected. And the all-party group has really been seeking this since the Lacanau House fire, that we look at sprinkler protection of buildings. And there is a disconnect between the fire safety order and the building regulations, because when you're refurbishing, and that's the only time that I think we can deal with it, when we're refurbishing, like we did at Grenfell, that's the time to bring the standards up. But the building regulations only allow you to bring the standards to what they were before. You can't make them any worse, but you can't make them any better under the building regulations. Whereas the fire safety order would allow that. And I think we ought to use this fire safety order, we ought to use the building safety bill to make sure that our existing buildings, when they are refurbished, are brought up to the standard that we would expect, that will save lives, and there won't be that. When we say it'll never happen again, people don't die in sprinkler buildings. I mean, that's a pretty good statistic. And I know that there will always be examples where people have died in sprinkler buildings, but let's really deal with the existing buildings as well, whilst we're dealing with new ones. Does Richard agree with that philosophy?
Thank you. I'll bring in my colleague Charlie Pugsley in a few moments, because he's got the expertise around the bill and he's done lots of work around fire safety legislation. From my perspective, we have been very clear within London Fire Brigade and with the National Fire Chiefs Council about fire suppression systems, so not just sprinklers, about fire suppression systems and the speed at which that they can extinguish a fire, particularly internally, before it takes hold. And we recognise the benefit of that, and we have done national campaigns. We've made our position very clear on the importance of sprinklers, not just within high rise, but also with other areas such as schools, which you see the devastating effects of school fires. If I can bring in my colleague, Charlie Pugsley, who's Deputy Assistant Commissioner of Fire Safety and Fire Investigation, and ask him to provide any further information he wishes. Charlie, are you there, please?
Yes, thank you, Deputy Commissioner. Can I just check you can hear me okay?
Yeah, okay.
Can I ask
Okay,
you to
thank
be very,
you.
very, very swift now because we're running over time?
So the very short answer is yes, as Deputy Commissioner has said, we would always support sprinklers, particularly in the higher risk buildings. So it's not just high rise, we're talking about care homes and others. And we will continue to work with all groups such as Ron Keane and all party parliamentary groups to add our voice to the call to do so.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I have a very quick question that's come in from New Providence Wharf. Was there any evidence that the Waking Watch system was of assistance as part of the New Providence Wharf fire?
Okay, Charlie, can you answer that as the investigating officer, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've heard various reports. I think what we've got to be very careful of is because we've got a potential prosecution, we mustn't prejudice the outcomes. So I think if you'll bear with us, I think something the Deputy Commissioner and Commissioner have been really keen to do is to be as open and transparent with our investigation, sharing our report with the community and continuing to engage. So we will keep everyone updated.
Thank you.
Well, I won't compromise your work, but I will tell you there are deep concerns from the residents as to why London Fire Brigade has a Waking Watch policy. I think generally the view is it's not worth the paper it's written on as a policy.
If I can just come back on it, if I may, the Waking Watch is something that when we speak to the owners or the responsible person, there are a number of measures that we can take or advise them on. It's for them to take the specialist advice, whether it is a alarm-based system, or Waking Watch-based system, but we would always try and emphasise the need for an alarm-based system, and a Waking Watch is always temporary. It's not for us to, there's a misconception that we define and we ask for the Waking Watches. That's for the responsible person to determine the most suitable means, and they do that by the commissioning of an expert. It's for us as the enforcing body to determine whether they've taken suitable and sufficient measures to make that building safe for the residents. We do not define that. But Charlie, if you wish to come on anything else, more than welcome.
No, I think you've covered that, boss. It's just really to reaffirm it is not our policy. It's for the competent person and the responsible person. We're the enforcing authority.
Okay, so thank you both for that, gentlemen. Peter, would you like to begin to close the meeting?
Thank you, Martin. I'm Peter Bottomley. I'm one of the co-chairs with Justin Madders, now joined by Daisy Cooper, the Liberal Democrat. And I want to mention our three vice chairs, Alison Thewlis, Scottish National Party, Fleur Anderson, Labour, and Stephen McPartland, who did so much on the fire safety bill, Conservative as well. We've obviously learnt the fine, fix and fund. We haven't solved all that. I want everyone to know that there's a rally on the 16th of September, the Thursday, and the next APPG meeting for leasehold and commonhold reform. It's tremendous to work with David Amos and the fire safety group. Thank you for that. The point I would make to the minister, and if his minister's officials are still there, it's probable that most leaseholders can't have an easy way to claim their losses. Can they assign their right to sue, or to have a claim taken for them by a central public agency to achieve redress without risking more money they don't have? Landlords won't do it on their behalf without indemnity costs. A second technical question: government intends to get back, say, 4 billion in tax and levy. Does that offset the 5 billion they're putting into the cladding, or does it add to the money? If leaseholders are facing 10 billion more, where's that come from and when? I've asked the Prime Minister for a leasehold summit, haven't heard back yet. I want to thank LKP, the National Leasehold Campaign, and the cladding groups for all that they've done. And passing across to Daisy Cooper, I want to praise her for her 10-minute rule bill on a public inquiry into the building safety crisis. Over to you, Daisy.
Thank you, Peter. I simply just want to say a huge thank you to Martin for organising this fantastic meeting today. Thank you all so much for giving of your time. And I just want to say how refreshing it was to hear from Ted. Goodness me, so pithy. We treated it as a public safety issue. Loans don't work. 3 stories and higher have all to be treated as an emergency, and the government coughs up the cash. I mean, it just sounds so simple, doesn't it? Meanwhile, in Westminster, we're getting ourselves all tangled in knots and red tape and confusing ideas, whilst leaseholders are at their wits' end with their mental health in tatters, scared to be in homes that they can't sell. So I want to thank all of our speakers today, especially to Ted for giving such a fantastically clear and comprehensive route forward. I would echo the comments of everybody in the chat who was trying to offer you a job. Maybe we could crowdfund a salary for you. Maybe that's what we need to do to get you on the government books. But thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to Peter. Thank you to Martin as well. And we'll continue to fight through the Building Safety Fund and every other mechanism to make sure that your voices are heard in Parliament.
Okay, well, thank you very much for everyone for attending. That now brings the meeting to a close. Thank you very much for attending.